The bell rang longer than it should have. 4 seconds became 6, then the rhythm collapsed entirely, and I knew before the doors sealed that the count would not match. They handed me a data slate with last cycle's numbers already crossed out and a note that said discrepancies were expected. By dawn, 500 prisoners would cease to exist, and I would help erase them. I stood in the intake vestibule with my data slate already active, the chronometer rune blinking in synchronization with the midnight census bell's reverberations through stone and iron. The sound originated somewhere in the central spire of the penitentiary complex, carved into bedrock 700 meters beneath the lowest habitation levels of Hive Tertius. Each toll was supposed to last exactly 4 seconds with 3-second intervals. I had counted census bells for 11 years. This one extended into its 6th second before the second strike began, the rhythm already corrupted before the night's work had truly commenced. The Vox doors sealed with their usual pneumatic hiss, 6 layers of reinforced plasteel sliding into locking position behind me. I felt the pressure change in my augmetic eye, the lens automatically adjusting to the lower atmospheric density of the prison's interior environment. The air tasted of recirculated disinfectant and something older beneath it, a mineral quality that came from stone that had never seen natural light. Lumen strips along the corridor ceiling dimmed from their daytime white to the penitential red reserved for census operations and blackout drills. The red was supposed to encourage contemplation in the inmates while reducing the prison's power consumption during verification procedures. My designation was Penal Scribe Covenant 7, seconded from the Arbeits Administratum for 1-night cycle to assist with population verification. The assignment had arrived 3 hours before the bell, transmitted via sealed data wafer to my quarters. No explanation accompanied it. The order simply stated that my presence was required for census support during a scheduled blackout drill, and that I should report to intake vestibule secundus no later than the first toll. I had arrived with 11 minutes to spare, as regulations required. The arbitrator who handed me the primary data slate wore the coal-black armor of the watch rotation, his helmet reflecting the red lumen light in uneven streaks. He did not speak beyond the procedural acknowledgement. His gauntleted hand extended the slate to me, waited for my retinal scan to confirm receipt, then withdrew. The slate's casing was older than regulation permitted, stress fractures visible along its lower edge where impact damage had compromised the seal. When I activated the display, the last census cycle's population total appeared immediately. 14,732 inmates. Below that figure, in smaller script, a secondary notation read, expected variance, 3 to 7%. Do not delay count for reconciliation. I read that line 3 times. Variance was not expected in population counts. Inmates did not vanish or appear spontaneously. Every transfer required authorization codes, physical escort logs, and multiple biometric confirmations. Every death required rendering certification and disposal documentation. A functioning Imperial prison had zero tolerance for statistical ambiguity. The number of bodies inside at dawn should exactly match the number present at dusk, adjusted only for documented exits and entries. The unsigned margin note troubled me more than the variance figure itself. Annotations on official census documents required both scribe designation and authorization seal. This note possessed neither. It simply existed, embedded in the data like an afterthought or an instruction too obvious to require formal attribution. The handwriting was not digital but scrawled, suggesting manual entry at some point in the slate's history. The ink had faded to brown. From deeper in the complex, I heard chanting. The sound was distant and rhythmic, voices layered over voices in a pattern I did not immediately recognize. Prisoners chanted during prescribed penitential hours, reciting litanies of contrition assigned based on their categorization. Heretics recited the absolutes of compliance. Recusants chanted the admissions of error. Debtors repeated the calculations of restitution until their voices failed or their terms expired. But penitential hours did not begin until after the census concluded. The chanting I heard now was premature, unsanctioned, occurring in a temporal space where silence should have dominated. I turned to ask the arbitrator if the chanting was expected, but he had already moved past the inner vox door into the observation gallery. The door sealed behind him with a finality that suggested no reversal. The vestibule held only me, the corrupted bell's fading echo, and the data slate with its unexplained variance. The night had begun without full authorization, and I understood even then that it could not be stopped. I had been taught that Imperial prisons were instruments of certainty, not chaos. My training at the Schola Arbites had emphasized the purity of incarceration as a function. Guilt was established by trial, tribunal, or confession before any prisoner entered these walls. The prison itself enacted consequence without requiring moral judgment from its administrators. This separation was essential. We were not executioners deliberating over worthiness. We were processors implementing outcomes already determined by lawful authority. Every corridor in this facility had a designation and a litany. Every door bore a classification seal indicating the category of transgression housed within. The architecture reinforced compliance through its very geometry. Cells descended in concentric rings, narrowing toward the bottom where the most severe transgressions were contained. The design ensured that upward escape was architecturally impossible. The walls sloped inward, the corridors converged, and the air itself grew heavier as one descended. Prisoners moving downward felt the weight of inevitability. Those assigned to lower levels understood that their return to the surface was not anticipated. I had memorized the 7 primary classifications during my second year of scribe training. Heretics occupied Tier 1. Their cells inscribed with corrective scripture meant to expose the contradiction between their beliefs and the Emperor's truth. Recusants filled Tier 2, individuals who had refused lawful commands or obstructed administratum functions without falling into outright sedition. Tier 3 housed debtors, those who had failed to meet tithe obligations or had embezzled imperial resources. Tier 4 contained the witch-tainted, individuals who had demonstrated unsanctioned psychic potential without sufficient magnitude to warrant black ship transfer. Tier 5 held administratum delinquents, scribes and functionaries who had committed procedural violations severe enough to warrant incarceration but not execution. Tier 6 was reserved for the unclassified, prisoners awaiting final categorization or transfer. Tier 7 remained sealed except during specific enforcement actions, its contents never discussed in training materials. Justice here was pure because it was procedural. Every inmate existed within a documented chain of custody. Every punishment corresponded to a specific infraction codified in the Lex Imperialis. Mercy was not absent, but irrelevant. The system did not require compassion because it required only accuracy. If the records were correct, outcomes were correct. If procedures were followed, justice was served. During normal cycles, the census was a simple verification. Names were recited from the master registry, cell doors opened for visual confirmation, and the inmate's biometric signature was scanned to ensure no substitution had occurred. Punishments currently in progress were logged with their expected completion times. Deaths were noted and bodies marked for rendering. The entire process took approximately 6 hours for a facility this size, completed well before dawn when the day cycle staff arrived for shift rotation. I had participated in 14 census operations before tonight, each concluding without incident or variance. The faith I placed in these procedures was not blind devotion but reasoned trust. I had seen the system function correctly across multiple facilities. I had witnessed disciplinary actions carried out with precise calibration to offense severity. I had observed the machine spirits embedded in the prison's cogitator network respond instantly to authorization codes, opening doors and updating records with mechanical perfection. The Arbites, who oversaw these facilities, were not cruel. They were correct. Their actions aligned with regulations that had been refined over millennia. Deviations were errors to be corrected, not symptoms of corruption. If a door failed to open, The machine spirit required appeasement or repair. If a name appeared twice in the registry, a data scribe had committed an input error requiring correction. If an inmate displayed signs of mutation or possession, protocols existed for immediate quarantine and purification. Every conceivable irregularity had a prescribed response. The prison could not fail as long as its administrators obeyed the procedures designed to sustain it. This belief was reinforced every day by the chapel murals visible from the administratum quarters. The central panel depicted the emperor in judgment, his gaze fixed upon a crowd of supplicants divided into the righteous and the condemned. The righteous stood in ordered ranks, their postures identical and their faces serene. The condemned writhed in disarray, their forms twisted by the visible corruption of their souls. Between them stood an Arbeitsjudge, one hand raised toward the righteous, the other pointing toward the condemned. The division was absolute. There was no ambiguity in the emperor's justice, and thus there could be no ambiguity in its implementation. My own augmetic eye bore an etched catechism along the interior rim of its lens housing, visible only when the device underwent maintenance. The words were microscopic but permanent. Precision is piety. Error is heresy. Count without doubt. I had requested that inscription when the augmetic was installed, paying for the engraving from my own stipend. It reminded me that my function was sacred, that the numbers I recorded were not abstractions but expressions of the emperor's will made manifest in data. The prison was stable because it was complete. Nothing entered without record, nothing left without sanction. The walls were not merely stone but doctrine made solid. The gates were not simply metal but authority given physical form. To exist within this structure was to exist within the certainty of imperial law, a certainty that extended from the throne world itself down through every level of governance until it reached even here, 700 meters beneath a hive's lowest levels, where the forgotten and the condemned awaited their measured fates. I believed this completely as I left the vestibule and entered the intake galleries. The first escalation occurred 37 minutes into the count. The intake galleries occupied the uppermost tier of the facility, wide corridors lined with holding cells designed for short-term containment. Prisoners awaiting classification spent no more than 72 hours here before transfer to their permanent assignments. The cells were small but clean, equipped with basic sanitation and a single lumen strip that provided constant illumination. Privacy was not a consideration. Each cell's front wall was transparent armor glass, allowing continuous observation from the corridor. I walked between two arbitrators whose names I had not been given. They wore full tactical gear despite the routine nature of the census. Their shot cannons held at rest but ready. Their helmet displays flickered occasionally with Vox traffic I could not hear, internal communications on a channel I lacked clearance to access. They did not speak to me or to each other. When I stopped to scan a cell's occupant, they stopped. When I moved forward, they moved. Their presence was procedural, a security requirement during population verification operations. The first cell I scanned held a woman whose identification matched the registry perfectly. She was listed as a debtor, 43 standard years old, awaiting transfer to Tier 3 upon completion of intake processing. I marked her present and continued to the next cell. The second cell held a man who was not in the registry at all. He sat on the cell's plasteel bench with his hands resting on his knees, his posture suggesting neither distress nor defiance. His clothing was standard prisoner issue, the grey body glove worn by all inmates regardless of classification. His head was shaved according to intake protocols. Nothing about his appearance suggested irregularity. When my augmetic eye swept across him, attempting to match his biometric signature to the registry, the data slate returned an error. No corresponding entry. I stopped and reviewed the slate's display. The cell designation was correct. The expected occupant was listed as a recusant, male, 61 standard years old. The man before me appeared to be in his 30s. I checked the adjacent cells to determine if the registry sequence had somehow shifted. The occupants matched their entries correctly both before and after this cell. The arbitrator to my left noticed my hesitation. His helmet turned toward me with mechanical precision. Discrepancy. His voice emerged through the helmet's Vox grille, stripped of inflection. "The occupant does not match the registry," I said. "The expected prisoner is not present. This individual has no entry." The arbitrator consulted his own data feed, accessible through his helmet's internal display. After 3 seconds, he responded. "Log as administrative latency. Continue count." I looked at him, then back at the man in the cell. Administrative latency was a classification used when intake documentation had not yet propagated through the facility's data network. It suggested the prisoner had been processed physically but not digitally, a temporary discrepancy that would resolve during the next synchronization cycle. But intake processing always completed digital registration before physical cell assignment. A prisoner could not be placed in a cell without first existing in the system. The protocol requires verification before. "Log as administrative latency," the arbitrator repeated. "Continue count." His hand had not moved toward his weapon, but his posture had shifted slightly, a subtle tension that suggested the conversation was concluded. I looked at the man in the cell again. He had not moved or spoken. His eyes tracked me without apparent interest. I adjusted the data slate's entry field, manually categorizing the discrepancy as administrative latency, and assigned the cell a provisional occupant notation. The slate accepted the input without error. The man became data, incomplete but acknowledged. I moved to the next cell. The count continued. Most entries matched correctly. Faces corresponded to names, biometrics aligned with registry signatures, and the slate confirmed each presence with a soft chime. But every 8th or 9th cell revealed another mismatch. Prisoners who should have been elderly appeared young. Women occupied cells assigned to men. Faces I did not recognize stared from behind armor glass, bearing identification placards for individuals whose descriptions did not match. Each time, I reported the discrepancy. Each time, the arbitrators instructed me to log it as administrative latency. The slate's latency count grew. By the time I reached the end of the intake galleries, 47 prisoners existed in a state of provisional documentation, their presence acknowledged but not explained. The chanting had grown louder. It no longer seemed distant. The voices came from below, resonating through ventilation channels and structural conduits, filling the corridors with layered sound that made individual words impossible to distinguish. The rhythm was wrong. Penitential chants followed strict metrical patterns, each classification's litany adhering to a specific cadence that facilitated memorization and collective recitation. The chanting I heard now overlapped itself, multiple cadences occurring simultaneously, creating interference patterns that suggested either coordination or chaos. When I mentioned the chanting to the arbitrators, they did not respond. We descended to Tier 2. The punishment wing occupied a section of Tier 2 reserved for corrective rites administered to prisoners whose behavior required intervention beyond simple confinement. The architecture here was different. Corridors narrowed to force single-file movement, and the ceiling height dropped low enough that the arbitrators' helmets nearly scraped the stone. The lumen strips burned brighter here, white instead of red, eliminating shadows and ensuring that no action could occur unobserved. Corrective rites were procedural, not punitive. Punishment for its own sake served no imperial purpose. Each rite addressed a specific behavioral deviation with calibrated application of pain, isolation, or exhaustion designed to recondition the prisoner's responses. A prisoner who refused to recite assigned litanies underwent vocal cord stress conditioning until compliance became reflexive. A prisoner who damaged their cell faced sensory deprivation until the impulse toward destruction subsided. A prisoner who demonstrated aggression toward staff experienced restraint escalation until docility was established. The rites were documented with precision. Every application required authorization from a senior Arbeitsofficer, medical oversight to prevent permanent incapacity, and detailed logging of duration, intensity, and outcome. The system protected both prisoner and administrator by ensuring that nothing occurred outside regulated parameters. I carried a subslate dedicated to punishment verification, a secondary device that cross-referenced current rights against scheduled completions. My task was to confirm that prisoners undergoing correction were progressing according to their assigned timelines and that no unauthorized extensions or modifications had occurred. The first chamber I entered held 3 prisoners secured in restraint frames, their bodies suspended in positions that prevented rest without causing lasting physical damage. The frames slowly rotated, ensuring no muscle group could adapt to the stress. Hymns of compliance played from speakers mounted at angles calculated to make the sound inescapable. The prisoners' mouths moved in synchronized recitation, their voices raw from hours of forced repetition. I checked the subslate. These 3 were listed as undergoing standard compliance conditioning, scheduled for 72-hour duration, currently 49 hours into the process. The timing aligned. Their biometric readings, heart rate, respiration, core temperature fell within acceptable stress parameters. I marked them as verified and moved to the next chamber. The second chamber was supposed to be empty. According to the schedule, its occupant had completed sensory deprivation conditioning 18 hours prior and had been transferred back to general holding. The chamber should have been powered down, its restraint systems inactive pending the next assignment. Instead, I found the chamber still active, its interior lights extinguished, and something moving in the darkness beyond the observation port. I activated the chamber's external lumen, flooding the interior with light. A woman hung suspended in a deprivation harness, her eyes squeezed shut against the sudden brightness, her body rigid with sustained tension. Sensory deprivation conditioning required absolute darkness and silence for effectiveness. The presence of light invalidated the procedure. I consulted the subslate again. The prisoner listed for this chamber was male, age 56, scheduled for 48 hours of isolation due to refusing food intake. The woman before me did not match that description. More troubling, her status in the system was marked as processed and transferred. The arbitrator behind me moved to the observation port and reviewed the chamber himself. His helmet tilted slightly as he processed the discrepancy. "Registry shows completion," he said. "The chamber is still active," I replied. "The occupant does not match." He was silent for 4 seconds. Then, "Mark as processing continuation. Note for shift supervisor review. The procedure is complete according to mark as processing continuation." I entered the notation. The woman remained in the harness, her eyes still closed, her breathing shallow. I moved to the next chamber. The pattern repeated. Chambers listed as vacant held occupants. Prisoners marked as transferred were still secured in restraint systems. Procedures recorded as complete were clearly ongoing, the evidence of continuation visible in the prisoner's physical states: abraded skin, dehydration markers, muscle tremors from sustained stress. The sensory environment had changed. The air here carried the smell of sweat and disinfectant, but also something organic and wrong, a sweetness that suggested tissue breakdown. The restraint engines hummed at frequencies that made my teeth ache. A vibration transmitted through the floor and into my bones. When a corrective rite reached its conclusion, a sanctioned officer would strike the prisoner once across the shoulders with a blessed rod, the impact both ritual acknowledgement and final sensory shock before release. I heard those impacts echoing from chambers I had not yet reached, the wet sound of metal on flesh occurring at intervals too frequent for the number of scheduled completions. I checked the chronometer. We were 93 minutes into the census. The count was already behind schedule, and we had not yet reached Tier 3. The data slate's variance calculation had grown. Where the initial notation suggested 3 to 7% discrepancy, the current total showed 12% of verified prisoners either misidentified or unaccounted for. I wanted to stop. I wanted to request clarification from a senior administrator to pause the count until the registry could be synchronized and the discrepancies resolved. But the midnight census bell had rung. The night had formal temporal boundaries. Dawn would arrive in precisely 4 hours and 27 minutes, and regulations required the census to conclude before first light. Pausing would invalidate the count entirely, forcing a restart that could not be completed within the remaining time. The arbitrators had not suggested stopping. They advanced through the punishment wing with methodical precision, opening each chamber, allowing me to verify its contents, and moving to the next without comment or hesitation. Their compliance with procedure was absolute. If they perceived irregularities, they gave no indication. They simply continued, and I continued with them, because stopping required authority I did not possess. We reached the rendering section at the punishment wing's terminus. This area processed prisoners who had died during their sentences, either from natural causes, failed corrective procedures, or sanctioned execution. Bodies were identified, documented, and rendered into component materials suitable for industrial reclamation. Nothing was wasted in the Imperium's economy. Even the dead served. The rendering chamber was a large space dominated by industrial machinery, its walls lined with refrigeration units designed to preserve bodies awaiting processing. The scent of chemical preservatives overpowered everything else, a sharp, astringent smell that burned the back of my throat. Lumen strips cast everything in cold blue light. 17 bodies lay on processing slabs, arranged in neat rows. According to my subslate, 9 deaths had occurred in the past 24 hours, all documented with cause of death certifications and disposal authorizations. 17 bodies suggested 8 undocumented deaths. I moved between the slabs, scanning each corpse's biometric residue. The augmetic eye could read certain biomarkers even from deceased tissue if the death was recent enough. 7 of the bodies matched pending disposal records. 2 matched prisoners, listed as alive in other tiers. The remaining 8 returned no matches at all. One of those 8 had clearly been dead for longer than regulations permitted before rendering. Decomposition had progressed beyond the point where reclamation was viable. Rendering had to occur within 48 hours of death to maintain material quality. This body showed signs of advanced decay, the skin discolored and the tissue beginning to liquefy. I documented the discrepancy. The arbitrator reviewed my notation and added his own addendum. Rendering backlog, acceptable within operational parameters. I did not ask how a backlog could develop when rendering was mandatory and immediate. I simply recorded the statement and moved toward the exit. As I passed the final slab, the body on it moved. The motion was subtle, a tremor in the fingers of the left hand. I stopped and looked directly at the corpse. It was male, elderly, his skin bearing the gray pallor of death. No breath disturbed his chest. No pulse showed in his throat. But the fingers moved again, a slow curling inward as if grasping something invisible. I activated the slate's biometric scanner and directed it at the body. The reading returned confused data. No heartbeat, no respiration, no brain activity, but localized electrical impulses in the extremities. Muscle contractions post-mortem, perhaps, though the pattern seemed too coordinated. The arbitrator noticed my attention. Documented? Yes, but there's residual neural. Documented. Continue. I continued. Behind me, I thought I heard the sound of the slab being moved, the scrape of metal on stone. But when I glanced back, the rendering chamber appeared undisturbed. The bodies remained in their rows, motionless and properly arranged. We ascended back to the main corridor and prepared to descend to Tier 3. The chanting from below had stopped. The silence that replaced it felt heavier than the sound had been. The blackout drill began at the 2-hour mark. The warning came through the facility's Vox system, a pre-recorded announcement in the clipped cadence of Arbites communications protocol. All personnel were instructed to reduce non-essential power consumption and prepare for illumination reduction. Prisoners were commanded to kneel in their cells and recite the litany of endurance until normal lighting resumed. The drill was described as routine, a test of emergency backup systems and prisoner compliance during crisis conditions. The lumen strips dimmed in stages. First, the white light faded to amber, then amber to red, then red to the faintest crimson glow that barely distinguished walls from darkness. My augmetic eye automatically compensated, enhancing available light and overlaying the environment with false color contrast to maintain visibility. The arbitrator's helmet displays activated night vision overlays, their lenses glowing faintly green in the darkness. The litany of endurance was meant to be recited individually, each prisoner speaking the words at their own pace while maintaining the prescribed rhythm. What I heard instead was synchronized recitation, thousands of voices beginning and ending each phrase in perfect unison. The words echoed through the corridors with a resonance that should not have been possible given the sound-dampening properties of the cells. We endure because the Emperor endures. We suffer because suffering is service. We accept because acceptance is faith. We persist because persistence is purity. The litany continued, each line delivered with mechanical precision. I had heard prisoners recite it before, during previous drills and scheduled devotional periods. It never sounded like this. Individual variation was inevitable differences in breath control, interpretation, emphasis, but the voices I heard now merged into a single unified sound, as if every prisoner had become part of a singular mechanism expressing the same thought through thousands of identical mouths. Tier 3 descended deeper into the complex's bedrock. The architecture grew oppressive, ceilings lowered until I felt their weight psychologically if not physically. Walls narrowed, forcing the arbitrators to walk single file with me between them. The stone here was older, the original excavation rather than the reinforced construction of upper tiers. Tool marks were visible in the walls, the evidence of labor that had carved these spaces from solid rock centuries ago. The cells in Tier 3 were smaller and less maintained. Debtors did not warrant the same resource allocation as higher priority classifications. Many had been imprisoned for decades, their debts so substantial that mathematical resolution was impossible within a human lifespan. They would die here. Their children, if they had any, might inherit the debt. The Imperium's accounting was infinite and patient. I began the count. Most cells matched their registry entries correctly, faces aged by confinement staring at me without recognition or hope. But the pattern of discrepancies continued. Prisoners who should have been present were absent. Prisoners who had no documentation sat in cells marked as vacant. The administrative latency count climbed toward 100. Then the power failed beyond the drill's parameters. The change was immediate and total. The faint red glow vanished, replaced by absolute darkness. My augmetic eye strained to amplify light that no longer existed. Emergency lumen strips should have activated automatically. Chemical phosphorescence independent of the main power grid. They did not. I heard the arbitrators moving in the darkness, their armor creating small sounds that helped me triangulate their positions. One spoke, his voice calm and procedural. Emergency protocol engaged. Maintain position. I stood still and waited. The darkness pressed against my augmetic eye's lens, a physical pressure that made me aware of the device's presence in my skull. I could feel my pulse in the socket, a rhythmic throb that seemed too loud. Something moved in the cell to my right. I heard the scrape of fabric on stone, then a soft impact as if someone had stood and approached the armor-glass barrier. No light source existed to confirm what I heard. The darkness rendered me functionally blind. The arbitrator's helmet light activated, a narrow beam that cut through the blackness and illuminated the corridor ahead. The light revealed empty space, stone walls, sealed cell doors. He swept the beam slowly across the environment, checking each surface. When the light passed across the cell where I had heard movement, I saw a prisoner standing at the armor glass, his face pressed against the transparent surface, his eyes reflecting the light with an intensity that seemed wrong. His mouth moved, shaping words I could not hear through the sound-dampening barrier. The arbitrator's light moved on. The prisoner vanished back into darkness. A second helmet light activated, this one from the arbitrator behind me. Now I stood between two beams, their intersection creating a small sphere of visibility in which I could function. I retrieved my data slate and confirmed it was still operational. The device's internal power cell maintained its display, the screen glowing with pale blue light. "Continue count," the lead arbitrator said. "The power failure exceeds drill parameters," I replied. "Protocol requires..." "Continue count." I continued. The arbitrators opened each cell manually, using override codes that bypassed the electronic locks. Each door required 12 seconds to unlock, 12 seconds during which I stood in darkness broken only by helmet lights and slate glow, listening to mechanical sounds and prisoner breathing. The biometric scanner struggled without proper illumination. I had to position myself closer to each prisoner than regulations typically required, close enough that I could smell them, hear the small, wet sounds of their breathing, feel the heat radiating from their bodies. The augmetic eye compensated as best it could, but many scans failed to achieve acceptable confidence thresholds. I logged them anyway, marking the verification as compromised by environmental factors. In the 17th cell I verified after the power failure, I found a woman who whispered the same phrase repeatedly. Her voice was too quiet for the arbitrators to hear, but I stood close enough that the words reached me clearly. "Already counted, already counted, already counted." I checked the registry. She was listed as verified during the previous census cycle 6 days prior, her status current and uncomplicated, but her insistence suggested a different reality. I asked her what she meant. "Already counted tonight," she said, her eyes fixed on something past my shoulder. "You already counted me. 2 hours ago, different scribe, same process, already counted." I reviewed the data slate's time-stamped entries. No verification existed for this cell tonight. The previous entry was indeed from 6 days ago. I told her this. She smiled, an expression without humor or hostility. "You'll count me again before dawn, different scribe each time. Same census, over and over, until the numbers are right." The arbitrator moved us forward before I could ask what she meant by right. The cell sealed behind us, returning her to darkness. We completed Tier 3 and descended to Tier 4. The power had not returned. The emergency lumens had not activated. We moved through the prison guided only by the arbitrator's helmet lights and my slate's feeble glow, a small sphere of light descending into increasing depths. Tier 4 housed the witch-tainted, individuals who had manifested minor psychic potential without sufficient magnitude to warrant black ship collection. Most were harmless, their abilities limited to involuntary telepathic reception or weak precognitive flashes. They were imprisoned not for what they had done, but for what they might become if their abilities developed beyond safe parameters. The Imperium could not risk unsanctioned psychers, even weak ones. Containment was permanent. The cells here bore additional warding sigils, inscribed scripture meant to suppress psychic manifestation through constant bombardment with holy symbolism. The words carved into the walls created a text so dense that reading it induced headaches in baseline humans. I felt the pressure of it as we moved through the corridors, a weight behind my eyes that intensified the longer I remained. The witch-tainted did not recite the litany of endurance. They were forbidden from speaking during blackout conditions, their silence enforced by discipline collars that delivered corrective shocks if they produced sound. The corridor should have been silent. Instead, I heard whispers. They came from everywhere and nowhere. Voices too quiet to understand but persistent enough to notice. The whispers did not echo. They simply existed in the air, layered and constant, creating a susurrus that made concentration difficult. I began the count. The first prisoner I scanned looked at me with eyes that reflected no light, empty black orbs that suggested either blindness or something more troubling. When the augmetic eye attempted its scan, the prisoner flinched as if struck. "It sees," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Your eye. It sees backward." The discipline collar around his throat activated immediately, delivering a shock that made him convulse. He collapsed to the cell floor, silent again. I did not understand what he meant. The augmetic eye was a standard Arbeits model, enhanced with biometric scanning capability but otherwise conventional. It did not see backward. It simply saw. The count progressed. More prisoners reacted to the augmetic eye's scan, flinching or turning away as if the act of verification caused them pain. None spoke again. The discipline collars ensured that. In the 30-second cell, I found a man whose registry entry had been corrupted. The data slate displayed his information normally for 3 seconds, then the text began to shift. Letters rearranging themselves into patterns that hurt to read. I closed the file and reopened it. The corruption repeated, the data degrading before my eyes. I showed the display to the lead arbitrator. His helmet tilted as he examined the screen. Slate malfunction, he said. Log prisoner as present. Verification compromised. The corruption is specific to this entry. The device functions normally for all others. Log prisoner as present. Verification compromised. I obeyed. The man in the cell watched me with an expression I could not interpret. When we moved to the next cell, I glanced back and saw him standing motionless, his lips moving in silence, shaping words that the discipline collar would punish if he gave them voice. Tier 4's count took longer than the previous tiers. The witch-tainted required additional scrutiny, secondary confirmations to ensure no psychic influence had compromised the verification process. By the time we completed the tier, 3 hours had elapsed since the midnight census bell. Dawn was approaching, and we had not yet reached Tier 5 or 6. Tier 7 remained entirely unaddressed. The lead arbitrator consulted his helmet display, reviewing our progress against the required timeline. Accelerate verification, he said. Visual confirmation sufficient for remaining tiers. Biometric scanning secondary priority. The instruction violated standard census protocol, which required biometric confirmation for every prisoner regardless of time constraints. Visual confirmation alone could not detect substitutions or imposters, but the arbitrator's authority superseded my procedural concerns. We descended to Tier 5. Tier 5 held administratum delinquents, scribes and functionaries who had committed severe procedural violations. I found their presence more disturbing than the heretics or the witch-tainted. These were individuals trained in the same systems I served, people who understood the importance of accuracy and order but had failed to maintain those standards. Their crimes were not ideological or pathological. They were professional. The cells here contained data terminals, allowing prisoners to continue performing administrative functions as part of their sentences. The Imperium wasted nothing, not even the labor of those it imprisoned. Delinquent scribes processed low-priority documentation, verified supply manifests, and maintained archive indices. Their work was reviewed multiple times before acceptance, ensuring that their compromised status did not corrupt the data they handled. I recognized one of the prisoners. He had been an Arbeits Administratum senior scribe, a man named Covenant 4 who had trained me during my first year of service. I remembered his voice, precise and patient, as he explained the importance of documentation accuracy. I remembered his hands, augmetic fingers moving across data slates with mechanical precision. He had been exemplary. His cell held a single data terminal displaying a manifest requiring verification. He sat before it as he always had, reviewing entries with careful attention. When my light fell across him, he looked up without surprise. "Covenant 7, he said, his voice unchanged by imprisonment. Progressing adequately. I did not know how to respond. The arbitrator behind me moved closer, indicating I should continue the count without conversation. "You were sentenced," I said instead. "I was not informed." "Procedural opacity," he replied. "Delinquents are not announced. Our failures are archived, not publicized. I expect you'll understand eventually." "I don't." "Continue your count, Covenant 7. The night does not extend itself for sentiment." I marked him present and moved to the next cell. I wanted to ask what he had done, what failure had brought him here, but the arbitrator's posture suggested the conversation was concluded. We advanced through Tier 5 in silence. The visual confirmation process accelerated our progress, but it sacrificed accuracy. I could not determine if the prisoners I saw matched their registry entries with any confidence. Faces were difficult to assess under red emergency lighting. Age, build, distinguishing features all became ambiguous in the darkness. I recorded presences that might have been correct, marking each verification with annotations indicating compromised conditions. By the 4th hour, we reached Tier 6. Tier 6 was supposed to be transitional, a holding area for prisoners awaiting final classification or transfer to other facilities. The cells should have been partially empty, occupied only by the most recent intakes. Instead, every cell was full. The corridor was lined with faces pressed against armor glass, bodies crowded into spaces designed for single occupancy. I stopped at the first cell and attempted to count its occupants visually. 7 individuals were visible. The cell was designed for 1. They stood pressed against each other, unable to sit or lie down, their bodies forming a compressed mass of flesh and prison gray. The registry listed a single occupant, intake processed 48 hours prior, classification pending. I opened the cell's file and found a notation I had not seen before. Population condensed for capacity management. Do not enumerate beyond primary assignment. I read the notation 3 times. Population condensed. The phrase suggested intentional overcrowding, prisoners deliberately placed beyond capacity thresholds and then systematically excluded from official counts. They existed in the cells but not in the data, present but unrecorded. I showed the notation to the arbitrator. "Acknowledge and continue," he said. "The regulation states that every prisoner must be acknowledge and continue." I acknowledged. I continued. Each cell in Tier 6 held more occupants than its registry indicated, sometimes 2 or 3 times as many. I recorded only the primary assignments, ignoring the additional faces that stared at me from the darkness behind them. The administrative latency count became meaningless. I was not documenting discrepancies anymore. I was participating in them. The chanting resumed as we moved through Tier 6. It was quieter now, almost gentle, a sound that might have been mistaken for ventilation noise if I had not recognized the rhythm. The prisoners in overcrowded cells were reciting something, their voices merging into a whisper that followed me through the corridor. I could not distinguish the words, but the cadence was familiar. It matched the litany of endurance, but the emphasis was wrong, stress falling on syllables that distorted the meaning. We endure because endurance is all. We suffer because there is nothing else. We accept because we have no choice. We persist because we are not permitted to end. The perversion of the litany disturbed me more than the overcrowding. The words were nearly correct, close enough to be recognized, but different enough to constitute deviation from sanctioned text. If the prisoners had simply refused to recite, that would be defiance requiring correction. But they were reciting, maintaining the form while corrupting the content. I wanted to report it. I wanted to stop and document the exact phrasing, to record this subtle heresy for analysis and response. But the arbitrator's instructions were clear. Visual confirmation only, accelerated processing, completion before dawn. We finished Tier 6 and prepared to descend to Tier 7. The lead arbitrator stopped at the descent access and consulted his helmet display for 17 seconds. Then he turned to me. Tier 7 remains sealed, sensors complete for accessible population. Tier 7 contains prisoners, I said. They require verification. Tier 7 is not part of standard census operations. Its population is managed separately. The regulations do not distinguish between tiers for census purposes. All confined individuals must be. Tier 7 is not part of standard census operations, he repeated. Return to Central Data Repository, compile final totals, submit before dawn. He gestured toward the ascent corridor. The conversation was finished. I wanted to refuse. I wanted to invoke the specific regulatory text that required complete population verification regardless of tier or classification. But I had no authority to override an arbitrator's direct command. I was seconded support, not a primary administrator. My function was to assist, not to determine operational scope. I returned to the surface levels, leaving Tier 7 unverified and uncounted. The central data repository occupied a reinforced chamber adjacent to the Arbeits command center. Its walls were lined with cogitator banks, ancient machinery that maintained the prison's population records across centuries of operation. The air smelled of ozone and heated metal, the scent of electronics operating beyond their designed capacity. I was alone. The arbitrators had returned to their patrol rotations, leaving me to compile the census totals without supervision. A single tech priest attendant occupied the chamber's far corner, his attention focused on a malfunctioning data port that sparked intermittently as he worked. I connected my data slate to the primary cogitator and initiated the compilation sequence. The slate's accumulated entries verified prisoners, administrative latency cases, compromised verifications, and unscanned population fed into the central system. The cogitator processed the data, comparing it against the previous census totals and calculating variance. The final figure appeared on the display: 14,209 inmates. The previous census had recorded 14,732. 523 prisoners had vanished from the records in 6 days. I stared at the figure. A variance of that magnitude could not be explained by transfers, releases, or deaths. The documentation I had reviewed showed only minimal population movement, 4 transfers out, 2 deaths by natural causes, 7 new intakes. The mathematics did not reconcile. I checked the compilation parameters, ensuring the data slate had transmitted all entries correctly. The transfer was complete. Every prisoner I had verified existed in the system. The discrepancy was not a transmission error. I accessed the historical census records, reviewing population totals across the previous year. A pattern emerged. Each census showed a reduction from the one before it, small decreases that accumulated gradually. Over 12 months, the prison's official population had declined by 4,800 inmates, despite the fact that intake exceeded releases and deaths. The prisoners were not escaping, they were not being transferred, they were simply ceasing to exist in the data, gradually erased through procedural mechanisms I had participated in without understanding. The administrative latency classifications I had logged did not generate follow-up investigations. They marked prisoners as provisional, existing in a state between documentation and void. After a certain period, I could not determine the exact threshold. Provisional prisoners were automatically reclassified as errors and removed from active counts. The system corrected itself by declaring their presence invalid. The overcrowded cells in Tier 6 housed prisoners beyond their documented capacity, individuals who existed physically but not administratively. They were never counted because the system was instructed not to count them. The notation I had seen, "do not enumerate beyond primary assignment," was not a temporary measure but a permanent policy. The witch-tainted who had told me my eye sees backward had been correct in a way I had not understood. The augmetic eye saw what was present. The system recorded what was permitted. The difference between those two perspectives created a gap into which prisoners disappeared. I had been taught that Imperial prisons were instruments of certainty. I had believed that justice here was pure because it was procedural. But I understood now that the procedure itself was the mechanism of erasure. The census did not verify the prison's population. It refined it, removing discrepancies not by correcting errors but by declaring the inconvenient non-existent. This was not malfunction. This was design. The prison was functioning exactly as intended, perfecting its population through each verification cycle, reducing the number of individuals it had to acknowledge until only the most essential remained. The rest simply ceased, not through violence or execution but through statistical annihilation. I thought of Covenant 4 Inches Tier 5, my former instructor who had said I would understand eventually. He had committed some procedural violation that brought him here, and now he processed manifests in a cell, performing the same functions he had performed in freedom, but under different circumstances. What failure had he committed? Had he noticed what I was noticing now? Had he attempted to correct it, to report it, to resist the system's mathematical brutality? I would never know. Asking would achieve nothing. He was documented, categorized, and contained. His existence was stable because he remained useful. The others, the overcrowded, the provisional, the administratively latent, possessed no such security. The chanting I had heard throughout the night had not been madness or coordination. It had been recognition. The prisoners knew they were being erased. They knew the census was not verification but selection. They chanted together because individual voices were already irrelevant, because only collective sound could express what individual identity could not survive. The tech priest in the corner completed his repairs and approached my workstation. He was old, his augmetics ancient and corroded, his robes bearing stains that suggested decades of service in this exact chamber. Compilation complete? His voice emerged through a vox grill that distorted it into mechanical approximation. Yes, I said. 523 variants from previous census. Within parameters. The parameters allow for this magnitude of... Within parameters, he repeated. Submit final totals. Dawn approaches. I looked at the chronometer. 43 minutes until first light. I had compiled the census within the required time frame. My function was complete. I pressed the submission authorization, transferring the final totals to the Arbeits command oversight. The cogitator accepted the data without error or query. The census was concluded, logged, and sealed. The tech priest remained beside my workstation, his stance suggesting he had more to communicate. You are seconded support, he said. Temporary assignment. Correct. You will receive standard reassignment notification within 3 days. Do not discuss census operations with personnel outside this facility. It was not a request. The instruction carried the weight of procedural requirement, a command embedded in the ordinary language of administrative process. Understood, I said. He turned away, returning to his maintenance duties. I disconnected my data slate and prepared to depart. As I walked toward the exit, I noticed a detail I had missed during my initial entry. The chapel murals I had seen so many times, depicting the emperor's judgment and the division between righteous and condemned, included a third category I had not consciously registered before. Between the two groups stood a space, empty and undefined, neither salvation nor damnation but absence. The mural did not depict that space with figures or symbols. It simply left it blank, unpainted stone suggesting a category beyond representation. I understood what it meant now. I left the data repository and walked through corridors that had returned to normal illumination. The blackout drill had ended. Lumen strips burned white and steady. The Vox system played morning devotionals, calling the day cycle staff to their duties. Everything appeared normal, functional, and correct. I reached the exit vestibule and prepared to cycle through the Vox doors. Before I could initiate the departure sequence, an arbitrator intercepted me. He was not one of the two who had accompanied me during the count. His armor bore senior rank insignia. Covenant 7, he said. Report to Processing Chamber 9 for administrative review. I have submitted the census totals. My assignment is... Report to Processing Chamber 9. He did not wait for acknowledgement. He simply turned and walked toward the interior of the facility, clearly expecting me to follow. I followed. Processing Chamber 9 was located in a section of the facility I had not entered during the census. The corridors here were wider and cleaner, the architecture suggesting administrative rather than custodial function. The chamber itself was small and austere, containing only a desk, 2 chairs, and a cogitator terminal. A woman in Arbeits Lex mechanic robes waited inside. Her augmetics were more extensive than mine, covering most of her skull and both hands. She gestured to the empty chair across from her. Sit. I sat. She activated the cogitator terminal and began reviewing data I could not see from my position. After 27 seconds, she spoke. Census operations expose support personnel to data irregularities that exceed standard clearance parameters. Memory compliance procedures are required to prevent unauthorized retention of sensitive information. I have clearance for census. You have clearance for census support functions. You do not have clearance for pattern analysis or systemic evaluation. The observations you have made tonight fall outside your authorized knowledge scope. She was correct. I had been assigned to verify prisoners, not to analyze the prison's data architecture or to identify systemic discrepancies. My function was narrow and specific. The understanding I had developed exceeded that function. Memory compliance procedures are mandatory for all personnel exposed to unsanctioned data contexts, she continued. The process is brief and calibrated to preserve operational functionality while excising unauthorized cognition. You will experience no permanent impairment. I do not consent to. Consent is not required. Memory compliance is a condition of census support participation. You acknowledged this requirement when you accepted the assignment. I had acknowledged no such thing. The assignment order I received had contained no mention of memory procedures, but arguing would achieve nothing. The Lex mechanic was not requesting my agreement. She was informing me of a process already determined. She stood and retrieved a device from a cabinet behind her desk. It resembled a standard neural interface probe, but bore additional components I did not recognize. She moved behind my chair and positioned the device against the base of my skull, where my augmetic eye's neural connection interfaced with my organic nervous system. The procedure targets specific memory formations associated with numerical pattern recognition and emotional association, she said. Your general knowledge remains intact. Your ability to perform scribe functions remains intact. You will retain awareness of having participated in census operations, but will not retain detailed recall of discrepancies or systemic observations. You are removing my memory of what I learned. I am removing unauthorized cognitive formations that exceed your clearance parameters. What you learned was not intended for your knowledge level. The removal corrects a procedural exposure. She activated the device. I felt a coldness spread through my skull, starting at the connection point and radiating forward. The sensation was not painful but profoundly wrong, like ice forming inside thought itself. The Lex mechanic began reciting prayers, her voice calm and rhythmic. Blessed is the mind too small for doubt. Blessed is the task that requires no understanding. Blessed is the servant who questions nothing. Blessed is the function that obliterates the self. The prayers continued as the coldness intensified. I tried to recall the specific numbers I had compiled: the total population variance, the historical decline pattern, the overcrowding ratios, but the figures became vague, distant, like memories observed through fog. I tried to hold on to the understanding I had achieved, the recognition that the prison systematically erased prisoners through procedural mechanisms. The thought remained intellectually accessible but lost its emotional weight, becoming an abstract fact rather than a realized horror. The process continued for 6 minutes and 42 seconds. When the Lex mechanic deactivated the device and removed it from my skull, I felt lighter, not relieved, but diminished, as if something essential had been excised. You may experience minor disorientation for the next 12 hours, she said, returning the device to its cabinet. This is normal and temporary. Report to your standard duty station tomorrow morning. You will receive reassignment notification within 3 days. I stood. The movement felt strange, as if I had forgotten how my body balanced. Am I dismissed? You are dismissed. I walked out of processing chamber 9 and made my way back to the exit vestibule. The corridors seemed longer than I remembered, the turns less familiar. I reached the Vox doors and cycled through without incident. Outside, the hive's lower levels were beginning their morning routines. Shift workers moved through access corridors, vendors prepared their stations, and Voxcasters announced the day's work quotas. Everything was normal. Everything continued. I did not remember the specific numbers anymore. I did not remember the exact discrepancies I had documented, but I remembered that there had been numbers, that there had been discrepancies, that something had been wrong. The memory was like a scar, the pain removed but the mark remaining. 3 days later, I received my reassignment notification. I was transferred to Subsector Archive Processing, a position that required transcription of physical documents into digital format. The work was simple and repetitive. Each page was scanned, each word copied exactly, each file submitted without analysis or interpretation. I performed my duties without error. My superiors noted my accuracy in their quarterly evaluations. I was a model scribe, efficient and obedient, but something had changed, not in what I did, but in what I felt while doing it. The numbers I transcribed carried no weight. The documents I processed seemed disconnected from meaning. I continued to function, but the sense of purpose that had sustained me, the belief that accuracy mattered, that procedure served justice, that the Emperor's law manifested through correct administration had been hollowed out. I still believed. The prayers I recited were sincere. The devotionals I attended were genuine. But belief now felt like performance rather than conviction, a ritual maintained because abandoning it would require more energy than continuing. Months passed. The archive processing facility operated without incident. I completed my assignments, received my stipend, and returned to my quarters each cycle. My augmetic eye still bore the etched catechism. Precision is piety. Error is heresy. Count without doubt. I read those words during maintenance and felt nothing. Somewhere beneath the hive, the prison continued its nightly census. The midnight census bell still rang, marking the beginning of verification operations. Scribes still descended through the tiers, counting prisoners and logging discrepancies. The population totals still declined gradually, numbers refined through procedural erasure. I knew this was happening. The knowledge existed in my mind as fact without urgency, truth without horror. The memory compliance procedure had not removed my understanding. It had removed my capacity to care about that understanding. I wondered sometimes if Covenant 4 was still in Tier 5, processing manifests in his cell. I wondered if the overcrowded prisoners in Tier 6 still chanted their perverted litanies. I wondered if the witch tainted in Tier 4 still whispered in the darkness. But the wondering was academic, an intellectual exercise without emotional investment. They existed or they did not. The system continued or it did not. I served or I did not. The difference had ceased to matter. 1 year after my census assignment, I encountered another scribe who had performed similar support duties. We recognized each other from administrative briefings, though we had never worked directly together. During a meal break, he mentioned having participated in a census operation at a different prison facility. Routine verification, he said. Standard procedures, no complications. I nodded. Efficient process. Yes, though I experienced some memory irregularity afterward, minor cognitive adjustment required. Memory compliance, I said. Yes. You've undergone the procedure? Yes. We finished our meal in silence. Neither of us discussed the details we could no longer fully recall. Neither of us questioned the necessity of the procedures we had experienced. The conversation ended, and we returned to our duties. The Imperium endured, its prisons functioned, its systems processed, its servants obeyed. And somewhere in the darkness beneath every hive, in every penitentiary complex carved into bedrock, the midnight census bell rang each night, calling scribes to count prisoners who would gradually cease to exist in any record that mattered. The numbers were always refined. The discrepancies were always within acceptable parameters. The procedure was always correct. I continued to serve, my faith intact but meaningless, my function preserved but hollow. The Emperor required accuracy, and I provided it. The system required compliance, and I gave it. What had been removed was not belief, but the ability to suffer from believing. Silence settled where certainty once lived. The counting continued.